Over the last year, especially, we found ourselves having more and more conversations with clients and peers that all center around a similar feeling. Engagement just feels different right now. Today, we wanted to take some time together to step back from individual projects and share some of the broader shifts we've been seeing across the field, not just in engagement tactics, but also in how engagement itself is being understood, designed, and integrated into decision making. We see this as part of a larger ongoing shared learning conversation that we're hopefully starting with you all today. And we're excited to hear reflections and insights from you all along the way. So before we jump in, just want to take some time to quickly introduce ourselves and the team leading today's conversation. So we'll each briefly share a little bit about us. And yeah, so my name is Marissa Danker. I'm founder and CEO of Connect the Dots. Um, I started Connect the Dots years ago in Ireland as part of a Fulbright project originally, and it was really focused on how do we connect different perspectives and get people really talking to each other and hearing each other from decision makers to communities. So I bring a lot of that in a design-centered approach to this work. Sylvia.
Thank you, Marissa. Hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be here this afternoon or noon or morning, maybe, for you all. My name is Silvia Garcia Garcia, Managing Principal with Connect the Dots. My background is across different sectors, everything from nonprofit, public sector, private sector, and also consulting. And my experience is mostly focused on social impact across Latin America, Southeast Asia, and now here in Northeast region in the US. So glad to share more about what we're seeing. And I will pass it over to my colleague, Jen.
Great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name's Jen Hurley. I am a director with Connect the Dots, and I'm a city planner for longer than I want to tell anyone at this point. But I had done a lot of training in mediation and conflict resolution before becoming a planner, and so I gravitated towards facilitating public engagement in planning, and that's been the core of my work as a planner. Okay.
Great. Thank you both. So for those newer to Connect the Dots, just want to take a second to introduce ourselves to the team. So we're a public engagement and strategy firm focused particularly on helping organizations make more informed, inclusive, and community-centered decisions. So it's very much about connecting community voices to decision-making processes. So a core part of our approach and how we do that is using creative, layered, and strategic approaches in service of making participation more accessible, representative, thoughtful, and actually actionable for different communities and audiences. And across our work, whether we're supporting engagement, strategy, research, communications, or capacity building, our focus is really, again, on shaping participatory processes to enable meaningful impact for both communities and decision makers. And a big part of what shapes our perspective is the diversity of backgrounds across our team and the range of projects that we work on. Our team brings experience across fields from strategic planning to environmental engineering, all the way to arts and culture. And that diversity kind of brings that magic in our team and helps us think more holistically and creatively about participation, communication, and decision making. And because we apply engagement across such a wide range of sectors and project types as well, we're often able to spot broader patterns and shifts happening across the fields, not just in one industry or one discipline. And that's a lot of what is bringing us to this conversation today. So I'm going to pass it to Sylvia to talk more about some of those shifts.
Thank you. So in our work, we're seeing a shift in the engagement landscape. This brings us to the purpose of today's conversation. And I want to start by saying that it is important to name the moment so we can move into what this moment requires. We believe that 2026 represents a uniquely complex moment for public engagement. Organizations, communities, and institutions are navigating overlapping pressures from different perspectives: political uncertainty, large-scale public events, evolving communication environments, and rapidly changing expectations around participation and trust. At the same time, widespread access to AI tools is changing how people consume information, evaluate the credibility of the content, and engage with public processes. So, as engagement practitioners, all of us here in this room right now, we're also being challenged to adapt how we build trust, how we communicate, how we facilitate participation. All of these is reshaping what effective engagement requires. That's why we have this prompt on the screen. I would love to hear from you all. What is coming to mind? How is your context looking like this 2026 from the public engagement perspective? Please share in the chat and we will be taking a look at it as we go.
Some that have come in through the Padlet are that there are lots of silos of communication and media platforms that getting the word for engagement or promotion is harder and harder. Shrinking budgets, grant cutbacks, fatigue. Yep. Less interaction overall. Lots of ideas in the chat. I see communication overload. Shrinking budgets are just difficult in general.
Yeah.
Perceived competition because of isolated funding opportunities. AI, we'll be talking about that in a second. Lots of distrust of government institutions. Equity and inclusion having negative connotations now.
Please feel free to keep sharing over the chat or in the Padlet that Stephanie shared earlier with all of us over the chat. So as a result of these overarching conditions, we've been noticing a number of shared realities emerging across projects, organizations, and communities. It's all that you're saying on the chat, and you'll see more of that reflected in the slides that we will be sharing with you all this afternoon. We're seeing shifts in trust dynamics. We're seeing growing engagement fatigue, as you all said. We're also seeing increasing pressure around transparency, coordination, and follow through. At the same time, many projects and initiatives are being delayed, paused, or reshaped due to funding uncertainty, political shifts, and changing priorities. We are also seeing more hesitancy around moving quickly on budget-related decisions, with some organizations delaying major commitments or pushing decisions into 2027. Combined with longer timelines and resource constraints, this is contributing to greater risk aversion and more cautious decision-making around where time, funding, energy are being invested. All of this together is reshaping both how engagement is delivered and what communities increasingly expect from engagement processes, right? So as you think about your own context, because as you can see in the chat, we have people from across the country and from around the globe. As you think about your context, what feels most present or pressing right now? Please share in the chat. We would love to read you.
I'll read a comment from our Padlet. Someone said that closing the loop once you've done engagement and come back to analyze internally, that some people feel it's hard to share. They feel afraid of sharing the wrong thing at the wrong time. but emphasizing that accountability has to be built from the start. Or people have so many opinions and don't show up. That's something we're seeing and experiencing. Engagement fatigue, definitely is happening out there. Instability is what we're feeling, experiencing. Someone said inflation, everything for all the costs of operating has gone up. There's a level of political reactivity at the local level that wants to respond to the loudest voices in the room, which overwhelmingly may sideline a project. Someone else in the Padlet mentioned momentum from increased equity after 2020 is faltering. Projects pushing only for virtual engagement, but not happening in person. And lots of planning, but the need for implementation.
Mm.
And organizational inertia, great word, to growing engagement systems. We'll be hearing about that from our moderated speakers in just a second.
Yeah.
And a lack of follow through. Yeah.
Yeah. Please keep the comments flowing in over the chat or over the Padlet. It's collective knowledge, right, that we're building here together. So clearly, many of us are navigating similar challenges, similar tensions right now, though this moment is also showing up differently across contexts, right? So on that note, I will hand it over to my colleague Jen, who will guide us through a panel of experts as we go deeper into these themes. Jen?
Great. Thanks, Sylvia. Well, I'm very happy to introduce our panelists today because we've got a really great group of people to fret about and discuss these issues together. First up is Milzy. She's the Director of Neighborhood Engagement for the City of Lancaster here in Pennsylvania. And she's helped make Lancaster Pennsylvania's first certified welcoming city through Welcoming America. Lancaster has done a lot of work in the last several years to try to coordinate community engagement across projects throughout the city, trying to address some of that engagement fatigue challenge. And Milzy leads the citywide work on community engagement. She is a graduate of Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative focused on public policy. We also have Shoshana, who is a great resource here in the Philadelphia region. She is the manager of public participation planning for our regional MPO, the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission. And she leads the Public Participation Task Force, the Supporting Communities Program, and the Municipal Help Desk. And then finally, we have Taya Winn, who is an architect and has 20 plus years of design engagement experience. She came to the Community Design Collaborative after serving as the director of project planning and design for Habitat for Humanity Philadelphia. And she brings a deep understanding of the Philadelphia design and community development landscape with a commitment to using design as a way to tackle social justice issues. So I'm very pleased to have the three of you on our panel today. So let's just jump right into our conversation. We're going to try to tackle all three of these questions, but I really do want this to be a conversation. So we'll follow the threads where they go. We promise to not just vent the whole time here. We are going to get to approaches, strategies, and tactics that are working. But let's start with what all three of you are seeing about what's been hardest about engagement recently and how has that changed in the last few years?
Yeah, I'm happy to hop in. Just because a lot of the things that people already put in the chat were what we as a panel discussed before we got started. The one that I definitely wanted to highlight is AI in both how we're trying to promote things and how that goes against sort of the more targeted ways that we're trying to reach people, as well as AI being used by folks that we're trying to reach. So we get a lot of bots, we get a lot of not actual people. But a positive example that I wanted to add is we actually recently had a focus group last week, and I noticed someone who English was not their first language. I noticed they were using AI in order to translate what they were trying to say to interact with the focus group, and they interacted a lot more than they otherwise would have. So I'm definitely not pro AI. Happy to talk more about that, but that was definitely a positive example that I was really happy to see someone get more access and be able to be included in a convo that they might not otherwise been able to.
I can jump in behind you. I think, and I think we've seen this increase since the pandemic. I think the pandemic set everybody's expectations that everything can happen online. And I think we're seeing that people want to either do things fully remote and then camera off, do things in the background, which is fine. I know many of you who are on this listening in today might be kind of being able to multitask the same way. And I mean, I do it in other spaces in my life, but I think it makes it really hard for us in trying to plan in-person engagements to sort of really drive home why their presence is needed in person. And I think that the tactics that worked pre-pandemic or even pre-2025, January 20th, 2025, to get people to come into a place in person has shifted because it's like food isn't going to do it when people are really, some people are like really physically scared to be in a space. So like I can't lure you with pizza and a $15 gift card to Dunkin' Donuts. And so I think what we're finding is that if they don't like, if they're not really, really, really passionate about whatever the issue is, it's hard to get them to come in person. And then you kind of get an echo chamber, right? You get the people that either were the most for it or the most against it, and you sort of miss all of the people in the middle, and it doesn't ever feel balanced. And I think we're still really struggling with that with our sort of network.
So it's same here in the city of Lancaster. I will echo both of the comments related to AI and the traditional versus the digital engagement, and really ensuring folks that are impacted by whatever project or initiatives have a voice in that process. So I completely agree. I will also say one of the hardest things for us here in the city of Lancaster, which is a really good problem, I'm going to say the good problem is we have really innovated with engagement, and I built a culture here internally related to engagement, and really have set the standard for how community engages with major initiatives. So we're at the point of we have an incredible internal demand from staff wanting more and more and more engagement, and how do we leverage that and have conversations on, do you actually need a pop-up for 20 responses? So we're having those conversations. Yeah, and at the same time we're having city residents come to council and say, you didn't put that on your public participation platform. So it's really, now we're at the point of like managing expectations both internally and externally, and it's pretty cool. It's pretty exciting.
That's great. I have a couple questions I'd like to follow up on things people just said, which is, and I wrote down 3 or 4 already, so I could go in a few different directions here. But, you know, years ago, we had this kind of principle of if you wanted to do equitable, inclusive engagement, you needed to get the whole system in the room. That's what we used to say, get the system in the room. And then if there were conflicts that people had different points of view, they could see each other's points of view, and we could try to work it out. My experience over the last, say, 5 years has been that it's really hard now to get the whole system in the room. because some people are participating on Facebook and other people are coming to the public meeting and other people are yelling on Twitter and they all pretend like the rest of them don't exist, right? What are you seeing that's working to connect those different perspectives and points of view to address them in an engagement process?
I can take this one because I'm dealing with this right now. So thank you. We in the city of Lancaster have, we're working on a very large nature preserve here. It's a beautiful space. It's located in one of our most marginalized populations, a lot of redlining there. And so including the residents and making sure that as we're developing this area, there is participation in the design and the conversations with the residents that are going to be mostly impacted, but also that it's a welcoming space for folks. And as this nature preserve goes live in a few years, it's going to draw in a lot more tourism to that area. So how are we having conversations to protect the identity of the neighborhood, also including them into the voices? So we just had a digital survey and a great response rate. But when we started to look at the response rate, we had a low response rate from the neighborhood. And so we had to really think about like, how do we go back? And so going back is canvassing, knocking on doors. There is a large elderly home that's there. And so we're going to show up one day and just, survey and talk to people in multiple languages and make sure that there is representation. So it's really important as a project manager, which many of you are on this call. It's great to have a high response rate. And then the second level is who is responding. And if the folks that are not, that you don't have a high response rate are impacted or are impacted by their project, it's important that you go back out. And so part of engagement is the iteration. It's just not one thing. It's just going through this iterative process and making sure that you're establishing that with project managers and establishing that expectation.
I think I can double down on that. I think the iterative process becomes really important. We were working on an initiative over the past year and a half where we were trying to get a very broad group, the city of Philadelphia, like anybody, to give us feedback around accessory dwelling units, which were already a little confusing and they were already complicated because they weren't legal here. And our funding got cut from the federal government. So what we had already planned to do on what was likely an ambitious budget to begin with got cut in half. And then we were like, well, how do we do this same work and try to get in front of these people? Because we felt like we were going to them with half the budget for the tools. And therefore, when we got pushback, we were like, this would have been better if we could have done it the way that we had planned. And so one thing that we had to sort of pivot is instead of doing a bunch of in-person things where we're doing a engage workshop, we started doing pop-ups, which anybody that had a community fair, we did Girard Avenue Fest, we did some things with Convergence and the city's housing fair, which is a very different thing when you were planning to do an engagement that was a workshop with a community group where 30 people were sitting at tables as a captive audience for an hour. Now you've got to try to catch them in one, you got to attract them to the table. And then you got to try to do it fast enough that if they're walking, they'll just pay attention or not leave mid stride. And so we had to figure out ways to break it down into bite-sized portions so that it was a quick survey, a quick visual. And then what we did was we created infographics after every engagement. So it wasn't a large pool. It might have only been 30 people, but we could say of the 30 people we already, polled, this is where people are. And I think it helped give context because then people could kind of look and see, well, what are people saying? And then you'd get their reactions because they'd say well, I disagree. And you'd be like, well, 30% of the answers felt like affordable housing was in person. And the person would be like, I don't think that's the most important. You'd be like, great, fill out the survey. It was a lot more work though, right? It was more work on my team. Usually we'd wait till the data was a thing was finished to crunch numbers. So sometimes we were a little worried about people using an interim number as a fact. We're or people kind of using it as hyperbole. 90% of people agree. And we're well, 90% of the people at this one community fest And by the way, 90% is like, at like 12 out of 17 people that stop by our booth. So I think that became hard. It was like constantly contextualizing the who, but the infographics were actually really useful. And like turning those around quickly was a little bit of a headache, but I think once we got something in place, it made it easy to update it too after every engagement.
Yeah, the one other thing I would add to both of what y'all are saying is that that public participation is never going to be done and it's never going to be perfect. This idea of like you could do all of these things and it's going to be great. You're going to hear from everyone. You're just never going to have that budget to be able to do that. So it's really important to be accountable and transparent on why you made the choices that you made, who you heard from, and how you fell short so you can understand how you're going to improve next time. And so that way, when someone comes to you and says, I didn't hear about this. I can't believe that you didn't talk to me. You can explain, this is what we tried to do. This is who we reached. Can you give us feedback on what we can do next? And that I think people, I mean, people always have a fear of getting criticism, and that's why public participation is sometimes gets a little shy. But as long as you have a defensible and documented reason on why these choices are made, you can go back to that and defend that moving forward and figure out the way to build something even better.
And the other thing is, even if you could talk to absolutely everyone, you might still have some conflict at the end. Like more
Absolutely.
participation doesn't necessarily resolve the conflicts that people have. Sometimes it does, but um, I think a couple of you brought up, the importance of iteration and seeing who we're hearing from and then finding new ways to reach people. If we're not hearing from everyone we're trying to hear from, I'm curious if anybody has just ideas of or examples of things, maybe surprising things that worked well in a particular instance to reach a particular set of people.
Yeah, we've been.
Um,
Oh, go ahead.
okay. Go ahead, Shoshana.
Oh, just that we've been finding that like old school, and we're talking about literally like 90s, early 2000s, so not even that long ago, but that old school stuff is working a lot better. Flyers, road signs. We did a radio spot for a recent project, and that provided so much more of like a community warmth because we were trying to reach them where they already are in like a familiar way, and doing any of those kind of strategies are really making people feel more trusted. I saw some people in the chat that using social media, people just have a lot of distrust in government. They have a lot of distrust in even the things that they're seeing online. So having more of those tactile ways are making people feel like it's real, that you are trying to reach them and you are a real person also. Go ahead, Taya.
I will actually say, I think, kind of expanding on that, but same thing. I think old school methods, but also unconventional methods. I feel like we've had a community event in Kensington. It was around a really difficult lot. It was a land bank lot, and there was a lot of thoughts and feelings about what was going to happen on it. And it was on a residential block, and it needed rezone. It's like a lot from our space. And we did our second community engagement a few years ago was a Eagles tailgate party. So like we got hot chocolate, we got marshmallows, we went out to the lot. I think it was like we still had the design boards and the design team trying to do a more traditional workshop on picnic tables. It was kind of a cold day, but like a lot of it was, how do we get people here and us listening to the community partner? And it was, nobody was really doing something exactly the way they would have wanted to do it on an inside. It was hard to hear. But at the end of the day, the plan was to activate that lot, right? So like we kind of piloted it by trying to do this unconventional outdoor. And I was like, well, look, we've had people playing out here all day. It's been safe. We've activated the lot. You kind of get a sense of what it feels like to have community in this space. Like, is it going to be a little bit different when the plan comes to? Yes, but like I think it helped people see the vision. And I think that was like we did not go in being like, let's do it outside so they can see what it would be like to activate the space. It was sort of an unintended consequence. And I think similarly, we had to move some things outdoors more recently for another project, another client in a neighborhood where they asked us to come and get, it's for a youth program, but they wanted to engage the adults and the neighbors and the parents, and they kind of have like it's like a speakeasy. I don't know that it's fully licensed, so I'm not gonna say where it was. But they throw these like parties, and it was like very specific to a particular ethnic community, and they have food pop-ups, and everybody kind of comes park their car, and it's sort of like the secret party. It's not that secret because a lot of people go, including some politicians. But we were like, "You want us to pop up at the what?" And then they were like, "Oh, it went so well. We're gonna do a coquito festival in like 3 months. You guys should come and do one then too." And we were like, these are not traditional, like, people are dancing and going to the bar around us. And we're sitting here like, do you want to stop and talk to us about this community project? But we got people that had never heard of the collaborative or had never been engaged. And I think, we were there for hours, and like people were stopping and they were asking questions, and not traditional, which was, I think, frustrating for the volunteers and for my staff at first, because they were like, what are we going to do here? But in the end, it ended up being this like just really organically different but interesting way to talk to people.
It sounds like you're describing a community social event with some planning off on the side rather than I'm a
Absolutely.
planner, come to answer my questions. Yeah.
Right.
Milzy, you were going to jump in.
Sure, and I can share briefly. I will say we're the fun team, right? And I will say that at least for the city of Lancaster, I'm not sure how it is for Shoshana and Taya. We have this incredible opportunity to impact policy and engage people through that process, right? And so there is a mixed method and menu that we have here in the city of Lancaster, but sitting down and just planning about engagement and what we're going to do and be really creative, that's where the innovation comes in. So Taya, you went to a community gathering of sorts that was a neighborhood norm, and it's something that's traditional, and you popped up there, and that's part of community engagement because folks are utilizing that space. So how are we meeting the people that are actually impacted by the work that we're doing? And I commend you, and I know that's hard for like folks that are practitioners and like changing, but that's part of this. Like we have to go with the flow to make sure that we're supporting the people of voice and choice that are going to be impacted by this work. So for us in the city of Lancaster, it's about creativity. Working with public art, we work with like our Bureau of Tourism and Promotions, which is a special events team. We work closely with DPW and as well as community planning, and we have an engagement team on the police department. And there's like this competition of like who's going to be the most creative with their projects. It's pretty cool. And that's what I encourage everyone is like, this is where you can innovate in local government. And it's really important just to like show up and think outside the box while you're doing this work.
So a couple of you talked about community relationships and connections, and that there's the being creative aspect, but it's not just me as a planner sitting in my office being creative. I'm connecting with a community in a direct kind of way. How does someone get started doing that if they don't already have those relationships with the community?
I'd say that's the backbone of our work, right? Like as a third space, we typically have a community-based client, but like who we're engaging is their end user or their end clientele. It's not necessarily our direct relationship. I think for us, we've learned that like you've got to use the trusted agent method, right? We are really heavily reliant on that client and on that community partner. And I'm grateful that we've all been working typically in our, and at least for our projects in Philadelphia, most of us have enough of a handle on the Philly context to know like when the client themselves maybe has some blinders on or isn't as engaged as we would think. It's hard. I think especially when the client is either new to the neighborhood or new to the use or expanding their services. I would say that's actually been a theme of the last few years is we're finding people who've never had to engage the community before are all of a sudden having to do it for the first time, whether it's because, they now hit an RCO process, here in Philadelphia, And now like there's just a lot more engagement around like even for businesses or on corridors of like this expectation that you kind of have to talk to people and see see what they're going to do. Or if we're talking about new funding opportunities that are sort of requiring them to go, gut check or get signatures. And it's just a skill that a lot of everyday clients of ours don't have. Like they're used to saying like I'm the king of my kingdom and I'm just going to go do what I want. And I think that it becomes hard. I think you said, I think a few people, I think both Jen and I think also Milzy have mentioned like there's this echo chamber and fear that people have of doing that. And so I think for us, it's finding those trusted agents. And sometimes we have to, gently ask, strongly suggest that our clients reach out to other people that we might know in the neighborhood or force it, like, which becomes a little harder. But like, no, we have to do something specifically for this group. I think at the worst for us, it just means that sometimes we have to do an additional engagement, which is, usually within the same budget. We gotta have another meeting with this very different group of people.
And that's part
Shoshana,
of it.
yeah. Shoshana, I'm really curious how you think about this problem, challenge, question, because you work over the entire region. So almost any new project you're working on, that you're going to have new partners that you maybe haven't worked with before.
Yeah, I was gonna say, just to share the main example that we do this work, and what's been really useful for us is the participation task force was mentioned earlier in my bio, and I highly recommend starting any of this kind of group for any local governments or county, regional, and also happy to talk to anybody offline about how we started this. But what this group is a group of regional residents that we have a application process to make sure that we're having a representative sample of the region. That way we know that we're convening and at least reaching multiple people from each county. We're in the 9-county region, so it's the greater Philly area, surrounding counties in PA, surrounding counties in Jersey. And we convene this group with the intention of communicating with them, not extracting anything from them. So we're just learning and we're in conversation, because that's definitely a thing that happens with public participation. You're only going to us when you need something from us. We're trying to give things over this platform, and being able to have this consistent group that works throughout the year. It's a lot of work. I'm not saying this is easy. It takes a lot of time from our staff, but it's a really valuable tool for us to learn about what people are interested in. And it gives us that baseline of a resident or a community group that is in an area that we can then reach out to them when we have a project in that area. And we use our task force members for those projects. We bring them in to get insights on a project that's in their area, and that helps us with a good jumping off point from there. So happy to talk to anybody offline about that.
So before we move on to hearing the advice coming from Connect the Dots, I'd like to give each of you a chance for a last statement on, imagine you are speaking to a naive person who has not done very much community engagement work before, but has their heart in the right place. They want to do a good job. What's your best advice to them about how to approach this? And maybe can I start with Milzy?
Sure. I will say, first of all, for the folks that are on this call, we have a department. It doesn't mean that you need a department to do community engagement. Community engagement can be built into any project management, and it could be managed by any individual. And if you need more tools and have more conversations around that, we're certainly open to have some more conversations. And for someone that's just beginning, first find out there's so many other initiatives that are happening. Call their cities, find out what they're doing. And there are some very low cost, low barrier ways that you can make sure that you're engaging with individuals that are going to be impacted by a project that you're working on. And that could just be picking up the phone call, walking door to door, showing up at a school, having a conversation about a crosswalk. There's a lot of different ways, but at any level of where you are in your organization or in government, engagement can happen and you don't need a full department for that.
Great. How about Shoshana?
Yeah, something that I'd wanted to add earlier is that consensus is one of the hardest things to do, and it's honestly kind of an unreasonable expectation. It requires a lot of work and energy to get that to happen. So just knowing that like you are not falling short, the process is not falling short, maybe the expectations just need to be right sized for what you're trying to do. And conflict doesn't mean that you are doing a bad job. You are hearing how people are feeling. Sometimes what they're feeling is the frustration in the process. They're not the frustration in the actual project. Usually, if you show up, they're actually mad about something else. So having that like trauma informed way of being able to receive people is super helpful. And then just like the last thing related to all that, to really just be aware of how much like personal toll that this takes on you. There's a lot of energy to be a public participation professional, and so to just make sure that you're also filling your own cup and figuring out what the right balance to do all of this work is.
Great. Taya, you can bring us home.
Sure. I would say, keep calm and carry on. I think things are always shifting and changing. So I think the three things that are really important is to one, lead with listening. I think your partners, your clients, most of the time, if you're engaging, there are other people who are like place-based and situated that are much more on the ground. Listen to them. Like if it's fatigue, if the timing's bad, if your approach is sort of too hyper focused, they tell you, even if they tell you in subtle words, they usually let you know. And I think oftentimes we as practitioners are trying to keep to a budget or keep to a tool that we've already created or that is already done because we worked on it. I think you got to be flexible. I think that's the second one. I think it's iterative. I think you kind of have to be willing and open to break your own rules and learn where your boundaries and your hard limits are. It's like, we can break this up to this point, right? But and keep that big goal in mind. And then I think the third is to just make sure you build buffer into the budget, because I think where a lot of this work fails is because it ends up being perceived as either unpaid or understaffed. And I think by building it into the budget from the beginning, we're going to probably still run over and lose money anyway, but at least you feel a little more whole. I think oftentimes when there's extra meetings or things are taking too long and you're moving at the speed of trust, as a practitioner, you're like, oh my God, you just see you see yourself bleeding out. And everybody gets really frustrated and it bleeds into the engagement. And the people you're engaging feel that. They feel that pressure.
Great. Well, thank you all for sharing your deep experience with us. We really appreciate it. And with that, I'll turn it back to Marissa and Sylvia.
Thank you so much, Taya, Milzy, and Shoshana. I would say it's hard to go after the panelists, but here we are, sharing our take on recommendations. I will just give ourselves all in the room like a few seconds to, let this simmer. If an inhale and an exhale is helpful, let's do it now, because there is a lot of emotions, right, attached to the facts, to the knowledge that we just receive right now. So what we are sharing right now, it's our take and our recommendations. You'll see a lot of what you all have shared over the chat, the Padlet, and what we have heard from Milzy, Shoshana, and Taya, all together organized in a couple of slides. Let's get started. So our first insight, engagement cannot wait to begin at launch. In today's environment, engagement can no longer begin at the moment of public launch. We're seeing more and more that effective engagement really depends on what happens before engagement formally goes out to the public, as we heard from our panelists. In this moment, communities are not all entering engagement processes from the same place. People are bringing different histories, experiences, and levels of trust with institutions into the room. It is important for us to consider also that trust feels more fragile and uneven than before, which means that communities are paying close attention not only to what organizations are asking, but how they are showing up. Authenticity, transparency, and relationship building are becoming just as important as engagement activities or interactions themselves. That's why a consistent pattern where we are saying it's that one size fits all kind of approaches are becoming near to ineffective. Different communities and different audiences within the same community require different approaches, communication styles, and ways to participate. This is not new, but it's something that we're seeing more and more. So because of all of this, engagement is increasingly shifting from an outreach first approach to a research informed design approach, one that is grounded in deeper listening, contextual understanding, and also relationship building before the strategies and tactics are shaped.
You're muted, Marissa.
Sorry, talking to myself there. So our recommendation, therefore, is to start earlier, before major strategies, programs, or engagement approaches are fully defined, so that communities can actually help shape the direction from the very beginning. Organizations should be spending more time upfront, understanding audiences and local context before determining what engagement, strategies, or initiatives will ultimately look like. That means building a much stronger understanding of the histories, barriers, trust dynamics, and day-to-day realities, shaping how different communities and different people participate and respond. So practically, this can involve early listening efforts, relationship building up front, targeted insight gathering, and even full co-design processes. And this approach helps ensure that project investment is actually worthwhile because the strategies, programs, and engagement processes developed are ultimately better aligned with the people they're intended to serve. It can also help to build or often rebuild trust as people experience being listened to from the very beginning, so they have actual almost proof that they can then trust that they'll be listened to once the project fully begins. So this thinking overall is a big part of why at Connect the Dots, we expanded what we call our phase 0 work. So that's about doing really focused locality-based research and early insight gathering so that we can help organizations better understand community conditions on the ground, lived experiences, and then use that insight to inform the development of strategies, policies, programs, services, engagement processes, or other big decisions. Because really, in this environment, understanding communities earlier is no longer a nice to have. It's foundational to making better decisions.
Our second insight. So traditional engagement approaches are no longer enough. I'm sure that we all have heard throughout the conversation this afternoon. Communities and the conditions shaping them, either politically, socially, operational, culturally, are changing faster than many traditional engagement models were designed to handle. What once felt really predictable is now shifting midstream across trust, across priorities, and people's capacity to participate. So a lot of engagement still relies on static plans like fixed timelines, predefined methods, and so on. But those approaches often struggle, as we have already heard, in environments that are already moving, making it harder to consistently understand what communities are experiencing in real time. Right. So we're also seeing growing engagement fatigue, as Joel said over the chat, not because people don't care, but because they are being asked to participate repeatedly without always seeing how their input is used or reflected in the decisions. At the same time, participation has to fit real life, right? When engagement is designed around single formats or narrow moments, it unintentionally leaves out people whose realities require different ways for showing up, as we heard from our panelists. So all of this is driving a shift away from prioritizing the volume of participation that we collect and toward whether engagement produces representative, usable insights, insights that reflect who is impacted, not just who can come to a traditional engagement space or moment.
So our recommendation here is to really just rethink engagement design and delivery to be more adaptive, layered, and human-centered. So rather than relying on one traditional format for engagement or one specific participation moment, we should be building multiple pathways for gathering input. This doesn't mean that you have to do every tactic that exists. As we've talked about with limited resources, it's really about intentionality here. So this means selecting the best fit methods for your communities and your goals, and then designing and facilitating those tactics with your audience's barriers and motivations at the forefront. Underlying all of this, we've also found that what helps us navigate engagement now is building more flexibility into engagement plans from the beginning. Conditions change, participation patterns shift. Teams need built-in room and methods to adjust outreach tools, communication approaches, and participation formats as they learn more throughout the process. So in real time, being able to pivot and make changes. We also recommend, like Sylvia said, rethinking how engagement success is measured. So really focusing less on numbers and volume and whether or not participation is effective and whether it's actually impacting decision-making like we say it will. And all of this thinking is really a big part of what's shaping our engagement studio work at Connect the Dots. We're really working with organizations to support them through the full design and delivery of engagement processes and helping teams build really thoughtful, creative, and responsive engagement strategies that can actually adapt as the projects evolve. The future of engagement, like Sylvia said, is not static participation plans. It's responsive systems that are designed to evolve alongside communities.
Third insight. Oh, we stopped sharing. We can go to the third one. There you go. It was a beautiful landscape. Oh, there's a landscape again. Thank you so much. Our third insight, communities expect continuity and clarity. So when we think about community members, they are increasingly coming into the engagement process or the engagement interaction with an expectation. We talk about the expectations that they will feel coordinated, connected, and continuous over time, not fragmented or isolated. At the same time, political shifts, project delays, and pauses are putting real pressure on long-term trust. When timelines change or all these initiatives stall, communities don't just experience it as a process disruption, they feel it as or perceive it as the uncertainty about whether engagement will continue to hold meaning. So, something important for us to keep in mind. Engagement is increasingly being judged not in isolation, but by how connected and coordinated it feels across projects, agencies, and organizations happening in the same place, their place. In that context, communities are noticing when efforts feel fragmented or disarticulated, and the frustration grows. People are asking to participate repeatedly without clarity on how their inputs builds over time. That naturally results in frustration. As a result, people are paying closer attention to follow through, consistency, and whether engagement actually influences decision making. And as a result, engagement increasingly requires more strategic coordination and long-term thinking than before.
So our recommendation is to expand strategic capacity and within that treat engagement as core organizational work. Organizations need to be building stronger systems for alignment across teams, communications, projects, and decision-making processes so that engagement feels connected both internally and externally. So similarly, we recommend stronger internal coordination structures, clearer communication between departments, shared engagement roadmaps, and bringing engagement thinking into organizational planning and doing that earlier. This enables teams to more directly connect engagement to design, implementation, and follow through. And we've seen time and time again, like Sylvia said, like all of you have said, how communities are much more likely to stay engaged when they can clearly see how projects connect and how input is informing decisions and shaping outcomes over time. In response to these shifts, we've expanded our Connect the Dots partner work. This means that we support organizations as ongoing strategic thought partners, helping teams strengthen alignment, navigate these changing conditions, and think more long-term about engagement overall. That work can involve advising on engagement strategy, strengthening coordination across initiatives, and helping organizations respond more effectively to these evolving participation environments that we're talking about. Today, we're really seeing that engagement success depends just as much on internal alignment as external outreach.
And our last and fourth insight, participation is shaped by forces beyond the project. Another major shift that we're seeing is that participation is increasingly being shaped by shifts in trust, competing demands, public discourse, and overall social conditions. And across these many contexts, communities are facing growing barriers to participation, driven not only by the logistics and time, which is something that we used to pay attention to as a common practice, but also by access constraints, competing priorities, and uneven capacity to engage. Prior experiences with institutions also matter. Trust is cumulative, and past experiences of being unheard or not seen follow through directly affect willingness to participate again. At the same time, public discourse often feels more polarized and high stakes, which can shape how people show up in the engagement spaces. Importantly, these barriers are not evenly distributed across communities. It's important for us to keep that in mind. This is why thoughtful communication and facilitation are more than ever critical, as they directly influence whether community members feel really that participation is meaningful, accessible, and worth being part of.
So our recommendation here is to strengthen engagement skills and embed stronger engagement practices and mindsets within organizations and teams. So organizations should be focusing on building more in-house facilitation, communication, and conflict navigation skills, especially as, like Sylvia said, engagement spaces become more difficult to navigate productively. And as many of you noticed and mentioned, with shrinking budgets happening across the board, this idea can also enable cost savings down the line because there can be less reliance on external resources like consultants to deliver engagement. Also underlying these skill sets around facilitation and communication is the idea of human-centered approaches to communication, as well as stronger awareness of the factors that shape participation across communities. Teams need to really be better equipped in this moment to recognize when projects or engagement approaches may unintentionally create friction, exclusion, or distrust, and know how to adjust in real time. We also think that this moment requires a broader cultural and mindset shift in how organizations relate to communities. That means treating engagement as an ongoing relationship rather than a one-time participation moment. And by that, we also mean an ongoing relationship across projects, across years, across departments within cities, really making it more cohesive for people. And these shifts overall that we're seeing have really shaped the growth of what we're calling our Engagement Academy at Connect the Dots. And here we create customized trainings, workshops, and learning spaces and communities of practice really focused on facilitation, outreach, communication, conflict navigation, and of course, engagement strategy. What we've really seen is that even the strongest engagement strategies can succeed or fail based purely on how people experience them in practice.
So ultimately, the goals here are not just to have better engagement processes, but better decisions, stronger relationships, and outcomes that people can actually trust. We heard a lot of words around change, evolve, iterate. This is a practice, and it means we're always figuring it out, what we can do better for the next time. And we're still learning alongside many of you. So one thing we want to emphasize is that this is not isolated. These are broader shifts happening in how participation, trust, and engagement is evolving. And we know that no one organization has all the answers, which is why we wanted to host this conversation, to start a shared learning space around what we're all doing and how we're navigating it in real time, so we can understand what's working and what's changing. The hope is that together we can focus on starting earlier to better understand community context, designing engagement to be more adaptive, connected, and human-centered, building stronger internal capacity for coordination and continuity, and investing in skills and mindsets needed for today's participation environments. So although our event is ending, the conversation doesn't have to. Over the coming months, we'll continue collecting examples, insights, reflections, and resources through our shared learning platform and future conversations. And we invite you to keep adding ideas to the Padlet and return to it after today's event to see what we've collected from our conversation together. And finally, if any of these challenges feel familiar to you or what your organization is navigating, let's compare notes and ideas. We're open to keep talking. So thank you all for coming. We really appreciate your time. We invite you to keep adding your ideas to the Padlet, and we hope you have a great rest of your week. Thank you.